Good evening, or should I say good afternoon, Faith family. This is the day that the Lord has made. We get to rejoice and be glad. Today, I want to talk to you about this thing called provision. Let the church say provision. I want to read a scripture out of Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to read the scripture, then I'll back us into it, help it make more sense. The one scripture says, "So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." This is the tail end of a story where Abraham, in Genesis chapter 2, where Abraham, God told Abraham to take his son, his only son, Isaac, up the mountain, and he was to sacrifice him at that place. Now the problem, with this whole thing is that Abraham was told that he was going to be the father of many nations. He was going to be the father. He was going to reach many, many people, that his descendants would be unnumberable, just like the stars. That was the promise that Abraham had. The problem with that is that sometimes God's process doesn't look like his promise. Let me try that one more time. Sometimes God's process just does not look like his promise. So let's talk about this word provision. Provision is the action of providing or supplying something for use. It's an amount or thing supplied or provided. And so we're talking about now provision, that God is going to provide, because we understand that God is the great provider. And of course, in Abraham's life and in this story, we see how Abraham provided in a tremendous way. In a tremendous way. And so as we continue to do that, I want us to talk about this. His process. One, his promise, he's going to be father of many nations. His promise was that his children will be as numerous as the stars. But the process said you have to put out anything that does not point to God's will or God's way. It doesn't point to God's will or God's way. What does that mean? That means that God, of course, Abraham initially had a son named Ishmael. And he had it with his wife's bondservant named Hagar. Now listen, I don't have time to really get into this, but what happened is because he understood his promise, but he did not understand God's process. And because he didn't understand God's process, he and his wife got together. She said, "Listen, Abraham, why don't you sleep with my bondservant Hagar, and why don't you all have a children?" Because we know that God made us a promise, but they didn't understand the process. And anytime you don't understand God's process, you will misunderstand how to interpret his promise. And so what happens now is of course, Abraham is like, "Listen, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it." And so, of course, he did it. Now, this was a socially accepted practice. It was socially acceptable, but it was not God approved. And there are so many times in this life when we engage in things that may be socially acceptable, but they are not necessarily God approved. And so we have to understand that God's process says do away with anything that is not a part of his will or his way. But the second thing is the other part of the process was to take his son up the mountain to sacrifice him. Now watch this. This was not about Abraham's son. It was not about the son, but it was more about Abraham not putting anything or anybody in the place or priority over God. God is saying, "Abraham, understand, I'm going to provide for you. I told you, if you listen to my promise, you need to know that I'm going to provide everything I said." But Abraham did not understand. He understood the promise, but he didn't understand the process. And because he didn't, so here it is. He's taking his son up the mountain. Of course, it's an awkward time. His son is old enough, to understand that, that they know that when they go up the mountain, that somebody is going to be sacrificed. And we know that because of the dialogue that it had between his son. Said, "Dad, I see the fire, I see the wood, but where is the sacrifice?" And God said, and Abraham said these words, he said, "Son, God will provide." And we need to know that in the most crucial times that we may find ourselves in society, when it doesn't seem like life is making any sense, we have to know that God is still the God of provision. And that even though it doesn't seem like it, even though you can't see it, you have to know that God will provide. God's desire was to provide for Abraham all along. In fact, he named that place. he named that place on the mountain, the Lord will provide. That's Yahweh Yireh. That's Jehovah Jireh. That's how we say it. We say it Jehovah Jireh, but it was Yahweh Yireh. So then here's the question. Since God's desire was to provide for Abraham all along, then what did he provide? Because when they got to the mountain, of course, we could say that he provided a ram in the bush. We could say that was what he provided. But the ram, I think, was more just a prop in the story. It wasn't that he provided so much a ram, but he provided Abraham with the ability to hold what he had. Here it is. There was no new child. There was no new wife. There was no new opportunity. What he provided was maintenance. Let me rephrase it. He provided Abraham with the ability to maintain what he had. You know what, y'all? Sometimes the blessing is in something new, or sometimes the blessing is in getting something more. Sometimes that is the way that God blesses us. Sometimes he does bless us with new and more and bigger and better. That stuff is a blessing. But sometimes the blessing is not in the new, the bigger, or the more. Watch this. Don't miss that God's blessings come, watch this, when God provides not necessarily something new, but a new appreciation for what you already have. That's what God provided. He took that same son down the mountain. He sacrificed the ram that was provided, but that's not what he had, because the ram is more of a prop in the sense. What God provided was so much bigger than a ram. He provided maintenance. He provided Abraham the ability to hold what he had, because what he had was enough for everything that God had in store for him for his destiny. Can I just tell you something? That it may, you in this time, in this season, you may not get more, you may not get bigger, but what God will provide for you is the ability to hold what you have, because what you have is enough to take you into your destiny. That's the blessing of God's provision. Watch God move. Watch God provide. He's an amazing, wonderful, loving, caring God. He's an amazing God. Give God the chance now, not to give you something more, not to give you something new, but to give you a new appreciation for what you already have. Because what you have is enough to carry you to your destiny. Be blessed. Peace.